So welcome, everyone. I'm so pleased to have you here toward the end of this long semester. And for those of you who've attended our events in the past, this has really been a kind of wonderful chance for all of us to take a break from teaching, administering, parenting, working, whatever it is we're doing, and talk about that other kind of work we do, all of us in one shape or another, which is the work of writing. And so David and I have been coordinating these for about a year and a half. If you're new to our series, I'll just quickly say the way the format works. Which will not change. There will be one small change today, which is this event is going to last for an hour. So that hour will be, I will imminently turn it over to David, who can do very kind of pithy introductions of our three participants today. And after that, each of our three participants will have a chance to speak for about 5 to 7 minutes, kind of off the cuff, with their observations, experiences, engagements with the literary essay, our form of choice today for discussion. And at that point, we will open it up to questions and discussion from the floor, which David and myself will moderate as needed. Often we find that we don't need to moderate much at all, and we would benefit from even more time for that kind of discussion. But that's generally the format. We're very lucky to have been supported in all these events by the Levin Institute for the Humanities. Our director for that institute, Daniela Bleshmar, joins us today. And with that, I will turn it over to my lovely colleague, David.
Thanks, Emily. I was just checking to make sure my mute was not on, as it often is when I start to speak on these things. Welcome, everyone. It may be better if my mute is on. We'll see how this all goes. But welcome, everyone. Thanks for being here. I'm going to quickly introduce the panel. This is a fantastic panel. I'm really happy to have these three writers here participating and talking about their engagement with the essay. These are three profoundly accomplished practitioners of the form. We'll be hearing from Jeff Dyer, who is a USC English Department writer in residence, author of many books of fiction, nonfiction, and hybrid or genre blurring material. We also we'll also be talking to or hearing from Linnell George, who I think is one of the most significant essayists writing in Los Angeles, one of the most significant observers of Los Angeles as a landscape, author of a number of books, longtime journalist at the LA Weekly and then at the Los Angeles Times, and one of our most essential, well, I guess at the risk of embarrassing Linnell, one of our most essential public intellectuals in Los Angeles. And then we are also joined by Jose Vardy, whose first collection of essays, Interstate, came out this fall, a couple of months ago, and is just a really sort of lovely and beautifully kind of thoughtful and voice-driven look at kind of California, both through the lens of family and family history, but also through the lens of personal experience. And so again, as Emily mentioned, everyone will everyone will talk for a few minutes about their own about their process, their project, their relationship to the essay, and then we'll have a sort of full-on conversation about it. I just want to say quickly, I want to thank the Levin, as always, for sponsoring this series, and especially for letting us do the literary essay as a subject. This is one of my my loves, the literary essay. It's one of my areas of engagement, and one of my key frameworks as a writer, and I'm always curious to hear what other essayists have to say about the form. So I think what I will do in the interest of just the alphabet is we'll do it alphabetically. So we'll start with Jeff, we'll move to Linnell, and then we'll end with Jose. Like Jose, my last name is at the end of the alphabet, which is either a blessing or a curse, depending on what your situation is. So Jeff, would you mind kicking us off?
Yeah, well, thank you for putting that so politely, David, because I suspected that you were going to say we're going to start with the oldest. So I'm glad that you said I just had alphabetical precedence as opposed to any kind of age-based seniority. Okay, so thank you for inviting me to be part of this, and thank you all for listening. And I guess I'll begin by kind of lowering the bar, if you like, by suggesting some ways in which the essay is no big deal, really. And I guess the first thing is to say, I don't really know what we're talking about. The literary essay. Does this mean it's an essay about literature? In other words, some kind of version of a book review or a piece of criticism? Well, I suspect it doesn't. But then, of course, one is faced with the question, the literary essay. Well, what other kind of essay is there that's not that is you know, if it's not literary, you know, to an extent, it's not worth reading. I always think of that weird thing when people there's this category, as you know, in fiction. There's kind of commercial fiction, which people like, and then there's this thing called literary fiction. The idea being that, well, it's that kind of stuff that people don't necessarily buy in quantity, but it comes with a higher quality of adjective. So there's that kind of thing. I mean, I think that the key thing, it has to be that there is more to this thing of literary than just the quality of adjective, if you like. So I'm sort of putting that just as a thing so that we can, in an old style way, as we were taught at school, of sort of defining our terms. And I think it's worth emphasizing as well, in an additional way of kind of downplaying the essay, it's the form that we're most familiar with, in a way, the most unfortunate way. It's what we had to do at school. The essay, it's the arc, you know, there's that great moment in, I think, The Information by Martin Amis, when one of the middle-aged writers looks back on his writing life and realizes, oh, what's it been? Just 40 years of homework. And the essay is, that's what it is. That's our first experience of it, homework. And, you know, that's, so we you know, we on this panel, we're continuing to do our homework. So there's that. It's something that we're very, very familiar with. I think I'll downplay it in another way as well by doing that thing which I know people always love. I'm going to quote Bruce Springsteen. That song Dancing in the Dark, you know, with its great refrain, great sort of line where he says, I'm sick of sitting around here trying to write this book. And implicit in that is that he's saying, I'm sick of sitting around here trying to write this great American novel. That's what he's really saying. Think how rubbish that, how disappointing that line would be if he had it another couple of words. I'm sick of sitting around here trying to write this book of essays. It really doesn't really, it's not in keeping with all those other mythic elements of Americanness that Springsteen has mastered. So I think, let's put it like this then. Yeah, nobody kind of sets out on their writing career sort of aspiring to be an essayist in the way that, God knows, you know, for generations people have aspired to write the great American novel. And, you know, let me throw in a couple of quotes here. I mean, I knew these remarks were meant to be unscripted, but I did do a little homework. You know, I thought it was best not to go into this conversation completely naked. And there's this moment in that great book by Tobias Wolff, that great novel, Old School. And one of the narrator's teachers says this. He says, one can imagine a world without essays. It would be a little poorer, of course, like a world without chess, but one could live in it. Stories, though, one could not live in a world without stories. So I think that's another of these things whereby we downplay the role of the essay. On the other hand, to anticipate what I think Linnell and Jose will I hope they'll agree with me. There is, of course, a major storytelling element in the best essays. But continuing with this downplaying of the essay, in one of the volumes of Karl Ove Knausgaard's My Struggles series, a book which rather ingeniously sort of merges, dissolves the distinction between, you know, memoir, storytelling, fiction, and the essay. His friend Gear says to him in A Man in Love, everyone can write essays. It's the easiest thing in the world, he says. But of course, not everyone can do what Karl Ove is doing. And I mean, I'll just say a few more things, partly as provocations, but I mean, the idea not being not in the sense of irritating people, but as maybe stimulating. It seems to me that, I mean, there are exceptions, but typically I think the bulk of the best essayists tend to be people who've not devoted themselves to it full time, but have done something else as well. So there's a rather wonderful thing, I think, in Jonathan Letham's introduction to a selection of Mailer's essays. I think it's called The Mind of the Outlaw. And Letham says this: so yes, Mailer as stylist, yes. Mailer as essayist, yes, but also no, because it could never be so simple. Mailer's essays are those of a novelist, and they would be even if he quit reminding us it was so. So I think there's this kind of, there's that element that's important. And, you know, it's really not at all unusual for someone to say of Martin Amis, for example, yeah, you know, he's great, but, you know, actually, I much prefer his essays to his fiction. But it seems to me that a large part of the quality of those essays comes from the fact that he has written fiction. I mean, there are plenty of exceptions to this. I think a very interesting, the sort of really important case, I'm sure we'll come back to her, is Susan Sontag. You know, I think we all agree she really is one of the great essayists. And I think we'd also agree that if, David, you assigned us for this week's homework that we've got to read The Volcano Love and In America, I think our hearts would be pretty close to in our boots, you know. So Sontag, great essayist, great writer. Yeah, I think she is a great writer, but she's that interesting case that she's a great writer on the basis of her essays, certainly not on the basis of her novels. But I still think that aspiration, and what could be more aspirational than a novel entitled In America, you know, is an important part of what elevates her essays. I think I'll just say one more thing. Yeah, I always like that. Another line of Amis's when he's talking about Gore Vidal, he's sort of saying, yeah, Vidal's not much of an essayist. He's not much of a novelist. He says he's too clever to be a novelist, but he's a great essayist because you can't ever be too clever to be an essayist. So I think at that point I'll hand over to my clever co-panelists and see what they have to say.
Thanks, Jeff. I'll just say quickly, you left out Death Kit as an equally unreadable Sontag novel, in my view, earlier and more experimental. And I also want to say, I think Letham on Mailer, at the risk of throwing a bomb in the room, may be better than Mailer on Mailer. Anyway, our next panelist is Linnell George. Linnell.
Hello. I did not prepare, but I'm gonna be brief. But Jeff, I started taking notes because things were just kind of popping in my head hearing Jeff speak, and especially about this notion of, you know, essays and how we connect it to being in school. And I was going through some of my very old things in my parents' home, and I found an old notebook from, oh my gosh, it must be elementary school, and in my young essays, and it was so interesting because, and it had things up to like junior high school, I would say, and one where I was sort of plotting out what I wanted to be when I grew up, and I saw the roots of things that I'm still, taking apart and questioning, even to this day. There were roots in these, young teenage essays of mine that I'm still pulling apart. And that idea, I remember too, sitting in my French class and learning, the verb essay, to try and to solve. And there's something I've been, about the form that I've been drawn to. Also, as Jeff was mentioning, it's, I'm not a full-time essayist, but the idea that I call myself an essayist, I was thinking about like when that happened, and I realized some of it happened while I was moving from writing fiction full-time into journalism. And I needed to find a form that gave me space between the two things. And there's something about the essay form in asking those questions and tying those notions that I could do, in essays that I could not do in fiction in the same way, nor in journalism the same way. Sure, I could use reporting and research in essays, but I couldn't put myself in the pieces in the same way as I can in essays. And I don't mean me as central figure, but me as prism. I trying to think about like the essayists I read early, obviously, James Baldwin was probably really key, especially when I was a young journalist trying to figure out how to write about race, something slippery, and identity. How do you do that and ground it? How do you take something that's so abstract and ground it in your research and your observation and your reporting? And I thought, look at what this person is doing. Look at the way he's doing it. Look at the time he's doing it in. And when I was, writing, reported pieces for the LA Weekly, part of what I couldn't do was write about more layers of race and identity and the reported pieces, but I could do those in essays. And that's when I really started to sort of look for that, again, that space. Then I started looking at other people who were doing, in new journalism, who were people that were doing things that inspired me or showed me different ways to do things on the page, to make the page open up, make it more porous, make me think about form. And, I read, of course, Joan Didion. And, that was another like eye-opener too for me, because also writing about the region I grew up in and writing about everyday, I won't say she didn't always write about everyday people, but things that I observed every day. And I realized that I could, oh, you can do that too. And it's reporting, but it's also a personal take. So I was looking for examples, and I've always been looking for ways to break the rules, I guess, with writing, because I didn't feel like I fit in anything I was trying to do. Like, I just did not, I just thought I got to like develop something that feels more, I had to build my own home. And that's what essays are for me, is really like, my own structure that keeps changing and shifting. I'm sitting here looking at my shelf, and not to flatter you, Jeff, but I have many of your books on my shelves because you are someone I find inspiration from, because you break down the walls. And again, you do other things. And, I have a copy, and I will get this to you because I want you to sign my copy of But Beautiful. It was one of those books where, literally a bomb went off in my head, like, oh my gosh, this is so unusual and beautiful. And these are the ways you break rules and create new things that people can be inspired by. So to me, that's the essay is a jewel, and it's the jewel that I keep in a box and open up to play with, as a writer and a thinker. And that's it for now.
Great. Thank you, Linnell. There's a lot to think about. I think that, that question of voice and Baldwin and Didion and other things. And I definitely want to talk as we progress about reporting, because I think that there is a way that reporting factors into a lot of essay writing and opens up territory in a lot of ways for essayists. Jose, it's your turn now.
Thank you, Linnell and Jeff, so much. I'm like nodding along and resonating with a lot of these points to say the least, and I'll kind of piggyback on a lot of your guys' comments to kind of start to kick me off a little bit here. And particularly the authors that I grew up on were oftentimes multifaceted in the regard of being, you know, fiction writers, playwrights, poets. James Baldwin is a primary example. I think he's above me somewhere in a frame photo that I got from Lake Merritt in Oakland. Um, you know, folks like George Orwell and Homage to Catalonia, Down and Out in Paris and London, and those kind of more first person observation, to say the least, especially in Homage to Catalonia, of you know, different historical situations that you can kind of compare their experience from other experiences, both literary and, you know, in a journalistic nonfiction context. Um, I'm very kind of, I guess, new to being self-describing myself as an essayist. I come from a very heavy poetry and performance background, as well as writing fiction as well. And I oftentimes felt like spoken word, which was my kind of first gateway drug into literature, was my home, so to speak, to use your term, Linnell, because it was this place where, aside from a time limit, I was able to really tell whatever story I wanted to tell. There's the assumption through the stage and the kind of dynamic that whatever I'm dialoguing to you as an audience member is nonfiction because I am delivering it to you. But within that paradigm, you can, you know, tweak it to have fictional stories or kind of have all types of different storytelling dimensions therein. But you know, I also grew up as a skateboarder in Southern California, and skaters are attuned to seeing their physical space in entirely different contexts. Some call it vandalism, some call it creativity, some call it an Olympic sport nowadays, right? But it created at a very young age a new relationship with physical space, with urban spaces, with suburbia, and oftentimes the inquiries of trying to find new skate spots led to documenting our activities through photography and things like that. So at a very young age, you know, all these things are kind of coalescing for me, and found a space through stages, literal stages of, you know, performing arts in the Bay Area. um, but you know, over time, I felt like, you know, sometimes you don't want your words to compete with a cash register. Sometimes you don't want to compete with someone's Friday night at a show. And I needed an essay to allow myself the time to include research and to include broader inquiries through which I could answer, and in an essay. And I feel like essays for me, particularly in this book I just put out, is all about, you know, posing questions to myself about my family, my history here in California, our relationships with this changing state, and how I could answer them, not necessarily definitively, but through the experiences and the crafting of stories through the essay that help illuminate these different revelations. So, um, you know, the essays for me has been kind of a new found home that has allowed me to really, you know, find myself kind of in a new context. But it still allows me to use poetry within the prose, within the nonfiction space. I think a big thing for me was, you know, I went to grad school for nonfiction writing about 10 or 11 years ago at Mills College in Oakland. And I came into there with no nonfiction bylines, no essay background whatsoever, just poetry and performing arts, and really trying to see if this form was for me. And it really allowed me to kind of find new writers that were speaking to me, and it helped me answer a lot of, or helped me kind of realize, even when I was a poet, even when I was more deeply in the playwright community of the Bay Area performing arts scene, in a sense, I was always trying to write essays. So I think I'll just stop there for the moment.
I knew I would speak without unmuting. Thanks so much, Jose. And thanks to all three of you. So I want to urge those of you in the audience to raise your hands or put questions in the chat, or, you know, whatever. You can either raise your hands actually, but we're now on two screens, so probably better to use the tiny digital hand raise function. You know, if you want to ask questions, we definitely want to kind of open up the territory. I want to just address a couple things and ask a few questions as well. I mean, I'm going to start with the notion of questions that you brought up, Jose, and see what everybody thinks about this. For me, at least, one of the great things about the essay, and I do think it goes back to Montaigne and the kind of the idea of the essay, the French version, is that it is open-ended, and it's a form that supports the asking of questions without necessarily requiring or demanding coming to any kind of definitive or even partial answer or conclusion, which for someone like me who doesn't know what I think from minute to minute makes it an ideal form to work in. It's all about that exploration. So I want to ask you about, all three of you, about that notion of kind of the essay as exploration, both in terms of, let's say, maybe the more abstract aesthetics of it, but also in terms of practice. Like, how much do you know going in? And is it, is there a kind of way that the approach that you take towards writing an essay echoes from essay to essay, or is it each essay kind of defining its own set of terms? I always sort of make these questions jump balls, so anyone who wants to jump in to start us off is fine with me. So whoever wants to kind of speak first is great.
I can jump in quickly. I think for me, well, to quote one of my favorite writers, Percival Everett, he often, in many of his interviews, they ask him, like, what's your process for writing a novel? He's like, I have no idea. Like, everything is completely new. Like, I have no idea what I'm doing, and I've done it over 20 times, right? And I really understand that perspective to a degree. By way of writing these essays, the titular essay of my collection is based off of me digitizing a tape of my grandfather telling me stories about migrating across California, and then me going on road trips to those places that have little or no relationship or close relationships to my grandfather, and just seeing what happens, and just seeing what happens to me in that physical space. So it could lead to no writing whatsoever. It could lead to a flat tire. It could lead to anything, right? But that's part of the point of the essay, is that it allowed me to put myself in that journey and to propel that flight. And for me, that's really exciting. It's a very visceral feeling, and is very much reminds me of the times when I've been like a freelance reporter and things like that as well. Very different contexts and very different stakes, but there is that proximity.
Linnell or Jeff?
You go next, Linnell. That's all I can say.
Okay. I guess I would say that for me, it's all different. I never know what, and sometimes if something is really gnawing at me, I realize, like, I think I do need to write about it. And I don't mean I need to write about it as if I'm journaling. I mean, I need to write about it because I need to answer some questions about what this event means, what these series of events mean, things that pop up that seem to be having conversations around me. A book I read, or a film I saw, or a conversation I overheard, and I want to figure out ways to put them all together. And I keep little books with seeds, like writing seeds in it, and sometimes I'll go back to those and see. But a lot of it is really me asking and answering questions, starting out. But honestly, every essay I've written has started differently. The middle is different. Coming to an end is different. Whether it's reported and researched, or whether it just comes from within. I'm working on a series of essays right now. One of them started with this strange conversation I had with this gentleman when I was in New Orleans, and this one line of his that he just sort of threw out to me, not an insult, not a this, but I thought, well, what did he mean by that? And then I just started unpeeling, and that became the frame for the whole piece, and looking at different instances. So I try to stay open in my process, because I know that I just I don't have, and when I teach too, my students are like, they want that answer. They want that, is there a structure? Is there a form? Is there something that you can, rely on every time? It's like, unfortunately, no, except that it will come if I sit there and do it. So yeah, they're all different.
I was, maybe Jeff, you can speak to this, because since such a big theme of all the remarks too was the kind of hybridity that all of you have as literary practitioners, I'm curious, given what's been said so far, like how do you even know if what you're setting off on, for example, Jose, your example, or Jeff, yours, like, is it going to be an essay versus, a spoken word poem or a piece of fiction, or like, or do you just kind of start writing and then at some point you're like, oh, I think this is an essay versus, I'm curious then, like, when that type of like genre decision is made.
Yeah. Well, I think, for example, after this, I might write an essay on why I will never appear on a panel again with Linnell George, because actually Linnell's last remarks, I agreed with her so absolutely. I realized, oh God, it's my turn coming up, and all I can do is say, sort of like they do in the House of Commons in England, hear, hear. So yeah, my experience is so like Linnell's, and I'll come on to what you were asking, Emily, with just one kind of thing to really that I so agreed with, which is this crucial thing that, unlike the kind of school or academic essay, which is an entirely desk-bound thing, I think that one of the crucial points Linnell made is that there's no difference between stuff that you might be seen to study, that is to say a book or an artwork. There's no difference between that and stuff you're experiencing outside the study in life. And I think that's so important. So there's a hybridity there right from the start. And yes, I think the other thing that goes on is that I think we've pretty much all agreed, we begin writing. I mean, I'm slightly different to Jose in that I know that the one thing that it won't turn out to be is that I'm not going to inflict any kind of me as any kind of spoken word artist on the world. That is a mercifully closed door. But apart from that exclusion, I think one's hope always is that the eventual form of the thing might be imbued with some of the characteristics of that which one is considering, so that if you're writing, so it'll just be so that the gap between what's being written about and how it is written will be closed. So it's a question of relationship, I think. But yeah, Emily, the short answer is just sort of endless open-endedness and responsiveness, I think, to the thing.
I think that's a great point. And I want to just sort of double back and say, I often do what Jose was talking about, which is to go if I'm posing a question, or if there's a physical location or a series of locations, I often go there and just see what happens. And sometimes it pans out and sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes I'm working on a series of essays now that I would call personal criticism, in the sense, not in the kind of Marxist self-criticism vein, but although probably that too, but in terms of sort of writing about literature or particular writers or particular works through a particular lens. And a couple of weeks ago, I went to Las Vegas for the day, because one of the books I want to write about is a book that takes place in Las Vegas, and spent the entire day wandering around Las Vegas, essentially looking for material, looking for the essay. We'll see whether I found it or not. But sometimes that actual kind of physical movement through space is the initiating element of what's going to become the kind of linguistic movement through the page. We do have a question in the chat, which I want to ask. It's directed at Jose. It's from Donna Miscolta, who asks, Jose, regarding the writing process, when you were tracing the path of your migrant grandfather, was the writing happening in the moment as you were visiting those spaces, or did it happen later? And so that may sort of build out of of what we were just talking about.
And thank you for the question. So I similar to Jeff, I very much agree and applaud Linnell's previous comment, because that act of weaving these different threads together was very much an image I have in my head. In basketball, it's like the 3-man weave, when you're trying to kill time, but this is actually trying to write an essay. It's like, how do I get all these different points together to, articulate a point? And then, to answer the question from the chat, in these moments when you're experiencing, these things that are occurring, whether you're talking to someone, in my case, I was visiting like historic landmarks that may or may not have volunteer staffs, and I'm talking to some of the staff, and then maybe someone cuts into that scene. You're just observing it and living it and taking notes as you go mentally or physically after the fact. I kind of like to let those experiences marinate, and then maybe at the end of the day, take as many notes on my phone or journal as possible. One thing that I have realized though is that note taking is a critical process for just writing in general, so really just getting used to taking notes. And I feel like there's a social stigma. Maybe this is gone after with the pandemic, I'm not sure, but like the social stigma of like, oh, I'm gonna bust out my Moleskine at the bar and take a couple of notes, like how dignified and how noble of me. Actually, one time at a coffee shop, this barista who kind of loosely knew me was kind of talking. I asked him, he's like, "What are you studying?" I'm like, "Nonfiction," and he's like, "Oh, you're writing a memoir? Like, what have you lived?" And I was just like, "Oh, well, there you go." Like there's this like there's these notions about like experience and note taking and writing in public. Get over that as quickly as possible and take as many notes as possible, because those are the things that that's the repository you're gonna get back to articulate the points you're trying to make, or to continue to ask yourself more and more questions to help write the essay moving forward. So to answer the question, I kind of just take notes mentally as much as possible, and then really having enough time to sit down and write those essays, I go back to those notes and go from there.
Thanks, Jose. I want to ask a question. I mean, because we are in a kind of an academic setting, and there is, of course, great suspicion still, I think, in academic writing about the use of first person. And yet the kind of the public essay, the popular, I share your suspicion of the word literary, Jeff, but I don't know quite another word to use. But let's say the public essay in some way does rely on a kind of first person construction, right? The character of the narrator as a kind of guide. I've been thinking about this because I've been writing a little bit about Sylvain Lotringier and Chris Kraus and this notion of radical subjectivity, which infuses some of the publishing work that they were doing in the 1990s as a way of kind of like recentering the self in a certain sense, particularly among women writers, as a way of claiming voice and place. I'm wondering about your own relationship with subjectivity. I mean, the essay, even the most reported essay, is in some sense, I mean, we can look at Didion and Baldwin as an example of this, is in fact a subjective piece of work, right? The narrator as character, the narrator not just as guide or interpreter, but actively as kind of character moving through the essay. And I wonder if you can all kind of talk about sort of how that dynamic gets embodied in your work.
I'll say something here because it was something that I was thinking about when I was putting After Image together, and particularly when I was working on an essay about gentrification. I realized as I was moving through and collecting scenes and doing my reading and interacting with the reporting I was doing, I realized that for me, while I was going to be, of course, the lens, and I was also going to be a character, I also felt like there were so many ways to view this. And I don't mean like, one side and the other side. I really meant there were so many personal stories about how the most minute shift in a community would just derail things for people in their lives. And I wanted to make space for that. So in a way, adding more voices with my voice created a larger conversation about a more in a nuanced conversation about something that is such a hair-triggered topic. So because it wasn't for a newspaper or a magazine, it was for my book, I had space to do all of that. And it was really, really a freeing process to be able to be in conversation with the characters in real time. And then when I got home and to reflect on what happened together, when I brought them all together in my piece.
Great, thanks. Jeff, Jose?
Jose, you go next.
Yeah, it's interesting because I feel like the very first essay I wrote for this book is about me going to a bar every week and self-appointing myself as a DJ and just taking over the jukebox and just doing that. And this was very much a real life experience. And a lot of this book was motivated by me doing this very silly routine that I'm sure many people do across the world, hopefully. But you know, I think that's when I discovered that this is hysterical one, and that this I that I am very familiar with in this, to use that poetry example of that assumed first person experience through the stage, you know, that I was already fun to play with. So, you know, but in a nonfiction sense, you know, I really try to make it about, you know, what I'm observing and where I'm at. It's not so much about who I am, what I look like. You know, it's not that stereotype of here I come into the bar with a denim jacket. Like, it's nothing like that. There's no heroism here. It's, you know, it's really describing, using, you know, where I'm at and recognizing through the worlds that I'm putting out there through the narrative, you know, whether it's a tech industry or whether it's a skate spot or whether it's the middle of California in a farm, you know, the privilege I have of being in those places, the doors that are opened by way of certain things that are happening in these scenes, the randomness that's occurring all around me. How does that speak to these other larger arguments? And how does my many years being in California, writing a book about California, help shape that? So it's almost like, you know, I think prism is an accurate term, to use Linnell's point from earlier. But I also think it's interesting to recognize as a writer, you know, the privileges you have in telling the stories that you are trying to tell, and you know, who does or hasn't had those privileges before you, was something I thought about a lot writing these pieces.
Yeah, and I mean, I feel very comfortable writing from the first person. And I'll just throw this out, that one of my essays is called On Being an Only Child. And I wonder if that thing of, I mean, this is a nonsensical point, but I'll make it anyway. How about this? If you've got lots of brothers and sisters, then you're kind of halfway to being a novelist. Whereas if you're an only child, you're condemned to be an essayist. I mean, that's just a kind of thing of just, you know, being on your own with that one voice. And it's I think it's quite, for me, I mean, I actually, you know, me as a person, I'm not, you know, not particularly interested. It's the thing is that it's about the sort of style, and one's personhood resides in one's style, and one's whole consciousness is there in style. You know, style is not just a question of choosing clever adjectives or whatever. It's an entire kind of responsiveness to the world. And then I think at this point we can loop it back quite interestingly. And again, I mean, when listening to Jose's opening remarks, I kicked myself thinking, yeah, why didn't I mention Orwell? Because I think, of course, he's so important in this regard, because, you know, famously, you know, in one of those essays, he says that he felt that because of his consciousness of the manifold injustices of the world, it was no longer possible to devote himself single-mindedly to literature in the style of, say, I think he mentions Henry James. Instead, he says his kind of consciousness of the political urgency of his time condemned him to becoming, and this is his phrase, a sort of pamphleteer. Without question, you know, that's a lower form of literary life than being a great novelist. But of course, in Orwell's case, it's the thing that enabled him to be a great writer. And I think this thing of style is important because, okay, of course, you know, Martin Amis, a very flamboyant kind of stylist. But what Orwell reminds us is that thing, his famous thing of plain speaking, is itself as much of a stylistic invention as anything else. And crucial for Orwell is this kind of thing of that early, you know, that kind of reinvention of himself from Eric Blair into this person, George Orwell, who just kind of bumps into experience and processes it. Now, he's dealing with much more world historical events than maybe I've written about. But still, there is that kind of thing that we are dealing with a very, very particular consciousness. And what he does in his essays is exactly what the best and most entrenched first personists like Nicholson Baker does, let's say, which is that you find yourself in complete agreement with this response to the world. I mean, it's incredibly difficult to dissent from Orwell while you're reading him, isn't it?
Mm.
That's a really excellent point about the fact that, and I think it's true of sort of the commanding voice of many essayists. It's difficult to disagree for me with Didion when I'm reading her, although I often argue with her when I'm done reading her. But in terms of that, the kind of, you know, it's, and I think that's, you're right about that. I have nothing else to say except you're right about that. So,
but I come back to you on that, Dave, just very quickly. It's funny, as I get older, I find myself increasingly resistant to Didion. I just cannot bear Didion's syntax anymore. I just cannot take it anymore. Precisely because it's just so, I just can't bear the Didion, the overwhelming Didionness of it gets in the way of a responsiveness to the world. Anyway, that's just.
No, that I would actually make the counter argument, which is that, you know, in fact, the overwhelming Didionness is her response to the.
Oh, yes, it is. Yeah. The migraines, the headaches. Yeah.
So we have another question in the chat from Joanna Novak, who, this is for everyone. She asks, do you find the capaciousness of the essay, its ability to accommodate genres, stops and starts, digression, freeing, overwhelming, both? Does anyone want to jump in on sort of that kind of the range and space of it?
You know, very quickly, I love the fact that I can include like kind of anecdotes within essays, that I can let my mind be a little wayward and wander a little bit, you know. I think that's not to be meta with it, but you know, it allows you to kind of see part of the process that leads to these questions and these, you know, the experiences that try to develop the answers. You know, everything from random pop cultural references to different kind of asides, I think is very interesting. And can be used in a disruptive context. You know, I like, you know, throwing different weird asides from different kind of cultural things to bring back that element of weaving and into the argument, which is always fun. I like also like actually including photography within essays is really fun. There's even an essay I have where I kind of splice 3 photos together into one landscape photo, like to articulate a point. Things like that I think are really fun to do if you have the capacity. But again, if it's not helping you prove whatever point or non-point you're trying to make, then it should probably get out of the way. But you know, it's always fun to consider.
I could respond next if that's okay with you, Linnell. Yeah, what an interesting question from Joanna, because in a way, you know, we think of the novel as the most capacious form. That's the, you know, War and Peace is nothing if not capacious. So I think it's an interesting paradox that this smaller, more intimate form can actually be, yeah, able to accommodate stuff that that we're advised doesn't really work in novels. And I think one of the things that it makes room for is one's own debility or deficiency. So, you know, when I had aspirations to become a writer, that basically meant becoming a novelist. But right from the start, there was a problem there because I couldn't think of plots or stories, which I thought you needed a bit of in order to be a novelist. And then it was encountering, I mean, well, crucially, how strange, this has been going on for 50 minutes and I'm only now mentioning John Berger. It's a record. But Berger was the first time that I encountered this way of writing, which was both essayistic and creative. It was commentary and it was imaginative. So that was a very important thing. And it was the essay there which had the capacity to allow for what seemed to me a fatal shortcoming if I did want to become a writer as traditionally conceived.
Linnell, I want to ask you, I mean, you don't have to address it around this, but I want to ask, just because you often incorporate photographs directly into the essays, the photographs that you're taking. Certainly After Images, a book full of essays that include photographic material within them. So I don't know if that is something you want to address as part of the answer to this.
Sure, and I'm going to say this quickly while the leaf blower is off. There's The neighborhood gardeners have all come at the same time, of course. But yes, I started taking photographs. Well, I studied photography really early, like junior high school, high school, college, and then stopped once I started to really focus on writing. But photography had always been this way I expressed myself as well. And while I was teaching 4-4, I wasn't having much time to write. And so I picked the camera up again. And I didn't know that I was working on something until someone else from outside was looking at the photographs and saying, "Are you writing?" Like the photographs to the looked like writing. And I thought, yeah, it is a journey, and it's another way of telling a story. But when I use the photography in pieces I'm working on, it's never as I'm not usually writing about the image, because the image should stand on its own, unless there's something in that image that made me stop, that I want to unpack. And then oftentimes I may not use the image. I will write about the image. One thing I think about is that I was in New Orleans. This is this different trip, and there was a piece of graffiti that I was trying to photograph desperately, and I was with a friend, and usually we have to go, and the light was fading, and I just couldn't get the shot of that graffiti on this house. And it was something like, when we die, our coffins are all the same size, or something like that. It was, but that graffiti stayed with me, and it ended up being the last chunk of an essay that I worked on. So yeah, so my visual sense, and I realized, what Jose was talking about, this note taking, it's the photographs are notes as well too. I have no problem pulling out notebooks. My friends know I will be sitting with them. And I'm like, I'm not writing what you're saying. I'm writing down what I'm just observed behind you, because I don't want it to go away. But I find that if it's something very compelling, it stays, and it takes root.
Yeah, I'll just say that when my mother, this is years ago, was undergoing chemotherapy, I was visiting her, and I kept like keeping the notes in my head until I couldn't keep them in my head anymore. And then I'd go to the bathroom and write them all down. And then I'd come back. And after the second or third time, she turned to me and said, "It's okay, you can just take notes." So we only have a couple minutes left. If anyone has a question, please put it in the chat. But I want to ask this question. We've been talking about kind of strategies for essays when they're working, or when we're working towards something, or a kind of the process is moving forward. What happens when it's not? At what point in terms of essay writing for all three of you, or particular essays, do you realize you don't have something there, or maybe what you thought you had is something else, and you have to either set it aside or put it down or move away from it? I'm curious about, because so much to me of the essay is a kind of expedition or a fishing trip in some way. I'm curious about what happens for all of you when the fishing trip doesn't yield any fish.
Mm-hmm. I think in my case, there's lots of things that one just gives up on quite often, because I think quite often because one feels that, well, I feel that my individual take on it is not particularly interesting. It's sometimes I feel, well, sort of anybody could have this response to it, so that I feel that there's just no particular value in it. More typically for me, what happens, I think nearly every book I've written has started with me publishing some initial response to this experience or this thing, and then I've realized, oh, there's actually more to this, and then it turns out that it sort of grows into a much larger thing, not just a larger thing in that it's got more words in it, but it's grown into something which is really no longer, could no longer, it's not that it's grown into a book-length essay, it's become something which really is not adequately described as an essay, I think.
Okay. Jose or Linnell?
I think for me as well, I oftentimes face that fork in the road too of like, what am I offering into a new argument, related to this particular subject? Um, Oftentimes a certain, seed that might lead to what I think is an essay is just a chunk of writing that I just now have, and that's fine too. We'll see where that chunk of writing leads to. And maybe that leads to just more digging and more inquiry, and more research, which is always fun, frankly, to kind of find that research. And then that research is also a multidisciplinary thing. And I think allowing writing to be defined as a multidisciplinary activity can help you during the ruts as much as during the green light, everything's working, every jump shot is a make kind of moments, you know what I mean? So, um, just to allow yourself to experience these different forms of stimulation creatively, I think is always good. So keep that in mind during the ruts as well.
Linnell.
Yeah, I think too, I agree. And for me too, it's if I'm really grinding hard on something, but not in the way that feels like I'm digging and I'm finding things, if I'm just, it's just dirt. It's like, then I stop. I just think this is not time, or this is not for me. I've turned down things that people will feel like, oh, this is the perfect thing for you to write about because you write about this all the time. I was like, that's just it. I write about it all the time. And unless I have some really original something to bring to it, fresh, I would rather just say, thank you for asking, maybe next time. I would rather just not be part of that party until I actually have something to say,
Yeah, I often have thoughts like that too, where, something occurs to me, but either I've written about it a lot or it's too pedestrian there's nothing else. It's an observation, it's a tweet, right? Or something like that, as opposed to an essay. I'm wondering, do we have time for we have one more question in the chat. Do we have time for one more question?
I think we should go for it. I had a version of the same question, and it's really about the connection between sort of the literary essay and the work of the scholar. So I would love to hear people's thoughts on that.
All right, I'll read this out and then we'll answer that question. So this is a question from Miguel Morales, who says, while I've taught Chilean and Latin American essay in Chile, or when I have taught Chilean and Latin American history in Chile, essay in Chile, I have very often faced the same difficulty. Apparently, we are living in a time in which the academic paper is being considered like an essay, but in some way, the academic paper has a couple of rules exactly opposite to the essay, starting with the necessity of delivering evidence and answers instead of speculation and posing questions, the use of third person instead of first, and even a very objective formal language with regulated structures instead of trying to challenge and play with the language and the structures. So, from all of your professional experience as writers, journalists, and academics, in order to introduce and motivate both the reading as well as the writing of essays and not only of papers, how have you dealt with this problem with students who are used to the form of the academic essay? I think that's a great question in terms of sort of breaking through. Well, it's sort of going back to where we started, breaking through the idea of the essay as homework and maybe approaching the essay as art. Jeff, do you want to start us off?
Yeah, because I think mine will be the least nuanced position, really, because it really is a key question, and yeah, I'll just answer it as follows. I mean, I'm incapable of reading academic papers. I've never had much stamina for it, and now I have none at all. And I'm always, as far as is compatible with being a responsible teacher, I'm always urging students to talk in a kind of a non-academic language, partly because I've got to read what they write, and it's more fun for me to read. But the key thing in all of this is that it's all very well to say, don't do this academic thing, but what you've got to make clear is this alternative isn't just the equivalent of what art class was for me when we were at school, which was just 90 minutes of mucking about after the grind of 90 minutes of physics or chemistry, let's say, something like that. It's the thing that Sontag demonstrates as clearly as anyone, which is that this more, this less rigid, formulaic kind of writing actually demands an even higher level of intellectual rigor and yeah, let's leave it at rigor, I think. So it's certainly not an excess. It's not a sort of excuse for just mucking about. It's actually a sort of, you're moving on to sort of higher ground in a way, I would say.
Right. Jose or Linnell?
I'm going to very quickly sneak in because I can hear him getting closer. That is when I was in teaching, especially with journalism. I was teaching feature writing when there was an essay writing component. And because they had to root their pieces in reporting and research, and also, again, be that lens, I think it was a way to get them to understand how important it was, especially in this moment where there was so much, like, we were on the wane of blogging, but it was still so much me, that it was really difficult for them to understand in the beginning that, like, no, you were trying to convince someone, you were taking them somewhere. You know, we're watching you put this together. You know, we're with you. So show us, give us something that's solid that we can stand on. And, you know, and it doesn't have to be dry facts. It doesn't have to be this. You can show us and tell us. And that seemed to click, you know, but it took a while. It did take a while, but we practiced and we read things. I kept giving them things to read and live with and understand that you can break form, but also be mindful, you know, that you're trying to bring someone over to your argument as well.
Yeah. And I also think it's useful to remind them, once you give them those forms, I always say, you will be rewarded rewarded more for the ambitious failure than for the safe success. So I'm a big fan of the ambitious failure. Jose, we'll end with your comments on this.
Yeah, I mean, I very much agree. And I believe that, you know, with the essays, you know, to the point of bringing someone over to that side is, you know, you may not have the definitive answer through your essay, but you are trying to prove a point, or you're trying to illuminate several points at one time. And I think focusing on that and allowing yourself to tell those stories in ways that are authentic to the experiences that you're putting out there, but also in ways that are, you know, accessible is key. And I think academia has a lot, in the very broad stereotypical term, has a lot to learn from, you know, the essay form in that regard, I think. But, you know, one thing I love about essays is that they're also time capsules and that they allow new histories to be written. I think about Rachel Kushner's recent collective of The Hard Crowd. The first essay in there, Girl on a Motorcycle, is, in my opinion, like a definitive history book of what early 90s San Francisco was, you know. And so things like that matter. And I feel like the voices that tell that story don't, you know, have to kind of be first person in order for it to be told, in a sense. So breaking some of those barriers of form, you know, within academia and the expectations therein is always interesting. And I feel like essays are a perfect form to do so.
That's great. This has been a really, really wonderful conversation, and I appreciate all of you being here and all of your input. I want to thank, again, Jeff Dyer, Linnell George, and Jose Vardy for being on the panel. Thanks very much. Thanks to Daniela and Isabella and everyone at the Levin. Thanks to my fantastic co-curator, Emily Anderson. This is our last event, our last On Writing event for the fall. We'll be back with an event in the spring. So please come to that. And if you want to revisit this, it has been recorded, so that will be findable through the Levin Institute. I love these lunchtime conversations. Thanks so much, everyone, for being here. I hope you have a great rest of your day. Take care, everybody.
Thank you, everyone. That was a joy.
That's wonderful.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.